Well, I'm very pleased to have been invited by the Roundtable to share with you some of the key findings of a recent international report, A Legal Framework for Impact. The report was commissioned by the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, the PRI, and the Generation Foundation, and it concerns investors' fiduciary duties, including in Japan. I was a co-author of the report, and the report was published by Freshfields last July. So, 4 questions. What's the report about? Why is this issue of impact so important? What were the key findings? And finally, how are things likely to develop from here? First, what's the report about? The report answers a crucial question for institutional investors, which has been rapidly moving up the agenda. How far are institutional investors legally required or permitted to seek to achieve positive sustainability impact? In other words, can they help in solving some of humanity's most pressing sustainability challenges? In the report, we call that kind of investment activity investing for sustainability impact, or IFSI for short. And we're not doing that just to introduce another sustainability acronym, but as a way of labeling a sort of activity that we're focusing on. Investing for sustainability impact includes essentially any activity where there is an intentional use of investment powers, stewardship, or policy engagement by investors to get investee companies or policymakers or other third parties to reduce negative sustainability impacts and enhance positive impacts, and to do so in ways that are capable of being assessed. In other words, so that it's possible to establish that the investor actually is making a difference. So, the idea of investing for sustainability impact involves 2 kinds of impact. First, the impact that investee companies and other third parties have on sustainability factors. And then second, the influence that investors can have on that impact. Investing for sustainability impact must involve the second, investors, with the intent of changing the first, investees and other third parties. For example, an investor could take steps to get a reduction in a company's negative impacts, such as wastewater emissions, or to achieve higher quality corporate sustainability disclosure to inform impact-orientated activity, stewardship activity, and policy engagement. In other words, that this investing for sustainability impact activity is inside out. And that's because it involves the investor taking steps to shape its environment, not simply responding to what's coming at the investor from outside. Now, an obvious question in the context of the Japan Impact Investing Roundtable is, well, how does IFSI relate to what's often called specifically impact investing? Well, now, impact investing would certainly be an example of IFSI, but the activities we've looked at in the report under the IFSI umbrella would cover a much broader range of practices than has typically been the case with traditional impact investing. In particular, traditional impact investing has hitherto tended to concentrate on, unsurprisingly, investing, as the name would suggest. But because of a combination of modern portfolio theory, the use of benchmarks to measure investment performance, investor duties, which focus on financial return, there are limits on the use that institutional investors more widely can make of their investment allocation powers to pursue impact. Now, that's not to say that they can't do so, but what it does mean is that a key finding of the report is that investee stewardship activities and policy engagement to achieve sustainability impacts may be more important going forward. But it is important to emphasize that IFSI is fundamentally different from what's often involved in sustainable or ESG investing. Otherwise, we'll not understand why the findings of the report are so important. So what is that difference? Well, very broadly, as many of you will realize, much ESG activity is what you could call outside in. In other words, ESG investment approaches are often a kind of investee-specific risk management tool. They tend to be about investment decision-making and involve investing in companies that have a strong ESG profile and divesting from companies that don't. But unlike investing for sustainability impact, there's often no attempt to intentionally change the impact of the company concerned, something that can actually come as a bit of a surprise to those who've invested in ESG funds, some of whom could perhaps be forgiven for thinking that they have been misled. So, on to my second point, why is this issue of impact so important? Well, I've just given you one reason. Investors increasingly want to know that their money is being managed in ways that make a positive difference, as well as earning a good return. And the evidence for that is summarized in part A of the report, if you want to look at it. But there's also another reason, which goes to the very heart of why institutional investors are there. And it's this: most large institutional investors these days have a diversified portfolio covering whole sectors, markets, and economies. That's where modern portfolio theory takes them. Portfolio diversification is intended to reduce the investment impact of investee-specific risks, but diversification also means that the return on the portfolio is largely dependent on the performance of whole systems, sectors, and economies. But those are the very systems that will be damaged if sustainability challenges are not addressed. In other words, declining sustainability presents a significant risk to achieving the very financial outcomes that most institutional investors are under a legal duty to pursue. Investors should therefore have a very keen interest in what they might be able to do about those sustainability risks. In other words, how they might be able to have a positive impact on the race to find solutions. So thirdly then, what did we find about investors' legal scope for doing that? The illegal analysis on which the report is based covers 11 jurisdictions, including the major investment hubs, and among those, Japan. And it focuses on pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and their institutional investment managers. Now, there's a lot in the report. It's not just a standard piece of legal analysis, but it provides a framework for thinking about and doing something about the issues that I've just been mentioning. And I urge those who've not yet had a chance to take a look at it to do so, because the feedback we're getting is that it's really helpful. But briefly, what did we find? Does the law require or permit investors to seek to achieve positive sustainability impacts? To a significant extent, it does. Although, given the diversity of jurisdictions and investor types that we've covered, there are all sorts of variations and nuances. Financial return is commonly the primary goal of institutional investors, so the picture is clearest where sustainability risk bears on investors' duties to pursue financial goals. Here, where sustainability impact approaches can be effective in achieving an investor's goals, the investor is likely to be under a duty to consider using them and to act accordingly. Now, the report calls that kind of IFSI instrumental IFSI, because in that case, pursuing sustainability impact goals is always going to be instrumental to realizing the investor's financial goals. Turning to a separate category, cases where investors can pursue sustainability goals for their own sake in parallel with financial goals. The cases where that's possible are more limited, but there are instances in just about every jurisdiction, including in Japan, where investors can do that, usually subject though to prioritizing financial goals. And we've called that kind of IFSI in the report ultimate ends IFSI, because it's focused on achieving sustainability goals as worthwhile ends in their own right. So those are the two core findings, but I also wanted to highlight two other key features of the legal conclusions, because they're also important supplementary aspects of what we found. The first concerns collective action, and the second, the issue of practical pinch points. First then, collective action. Since sustainability challenges are system-wide and tend to result from collective failures of one sort or another, addressing them almost inevitably needs to be a collective exercise. And because of that, the report emphasises the importance of joining collective action in pursuit of positive impacts where investors are considering whether to pursue an IFSI approach. Now, traditionally, legal duties have tended to be approached on what you could describe as a rather individualistic basis. But essentially what we're saying in the report is that maybe the position here is more akin to an election. If one person doesn't participate in an election, it's probably not going to influence the end result, although in some cases it can do. But if everyone takes that approach and everyone fails to engage in the election, no one will get a good result and everyone will suffer. So investors may then be failing beneficiaries if they don't take part, and the equivalent to the election here is collective action. The second issue was the issue of practical pinch points. Now, as I said, the report is unusual as a legal report because it doesn't just analyse what the law says. It also looks at the rules in the context of the practical steps that investors need to take to achieve an impact. And in doing so, it identifies a number of pinch points that interact with the legal rules in ways that could impede investors in pursuing sustainability goals. And I'm just going to mention two groups to give you a sense for this, but they're not the only ones. The first group of pinch points comprises what you could call practical pinch points. In other words, the challenges of defining the goals for your impact activity, assessing progress towards those goals, including the challenges of getting the information you need, and then understanding whether the investor has actually contributed to achieving the goal. Why is that important? Well, legal duties always have a goal, and it's critical to be able to marry up impact goals with the investor's legal goals to assess progress, to understand whether the investor is actually making any difference. Because if the investor isn't making any difference, they won't be legally required to act, and they won't have any discretion to act. Now, doing all of those things can, in practice, be very challenging, even in an area like climate change, where there's already been a lot of work, there's a lot of information available. And so developing enabling frameworks is likely to be pretty important to investing for sustainability impact going forwards. The second group of practical pinch points are what you could call portfolio pinch points, concerning the effect on financial performance of attempts to achieve an impact, since the legal rules do generally require some sort of financial outcome. So, for example, the combination of modern portfolio theory, the use of common performance benchmarks, and prevailing legal duties, which, as I said, do focus on financial return, would seem to lead investors to concentrate their impact activities on stewardship and policy engagement to achieve impact more than using investment powers. It doesn't mean they wouldn't use investment powers, but the focus may need to be more on stewardship and policy work. And why is that? Well, among other things, it's because the financial performance impact of stewardship and policy engagement is going to be spread across whole investment markets, whereas individual investment decision making by individual investors has a direct, specific portfolio impact. So, what's the report about? Why is impact so important? What were the finally, where do we go from here? Well, up to a point, of course, that is a question for you as investors to answer. But let me say two things. First of all, changes in existing practice. We're seeing a lot of interest in the report among investors and their advisors, such as consultants and lawyers. For investors, many have already been dipping a toe in impact-orientated activity, and what they're telling us is that the report increases their confidence in doing so. So I think we're likely to see more for that reason. For the advisors, many are still operating in what you could loosely call the ESG ethical investing paradigm, but their attention is now beginning to turn to the very clear legal connection made in the report between sustainability risk and financial return, the risk that sustainability factors poses to the systems on which financial return depends. So again, and I'm seeing evidence of this, it seems reasonable to suppose that the market will continue to move further in the direction that it's already begun to move in pursuing sustainability impacts. And I think also, incidentally, to do so increasingly using collective action of one sort or another, like the net zero alliances. The second area to watch out for going forwards, I think, is policy change. There's obviously considerable policy attention to sustainable investing and finance, but hitherto a lot of it hasn't really distinguished clearly between the sort of outside-in activity involved in, say, ESG and inside-out activity like IFSI, designed to achieve sustainability impacts. Now, that's important for a whole host of reasons, not least because it means that disclosures around sustainable investing are often potentially rather misleading, and regulatory rules intended to facilitate sustainability impacts may not have that result if they're not grounded on a clear understanding of that key distinction. The PRI and others who've been engaging with the report are in the process of working with policymakers in a number of jurisdictions to address those sorts of issues. And I'm particularly aware so far of work in Australia, Canada, the EU, the UK, and indeed the US on those sorts of topics. So there you have it. What's the report about? Why is the issue of impact so important? What did we find? And where next? Thank you very much.